A tale where deep affection intertwines with the supernatural. A female doctor explores the boundaries of life, love, and personal choice amidst a fatal illness, and a mysterious spectral lover. She confronts her inner fears and external challenges while uncovering secrets within the hospital hierarchy. Chapter 1 Wrestling with Angels Operating Room 6, Case 3, to follow Surgeon, Hellman. Patient, Moran Anest, Warden Procedure, Temporal Lobe Biopsy Equip, Cranio Tray, Lucidine Protocol. Most of us only die once. Death is something we fear, we avoid, we struggle against, denying its inevitability. Not so for Grace D'Angelo Moran. For Grace, dying held no fear. Rather, it offered hope. She had danced with death, cheated death, even stolen from its all-consuming greedy grasp. Now, finally, Grace knew her time had come. She was death. Why else the paralysis of her limbs, the eerie disconnected feeling as if she floated outside her body? She heard Jimmy's voice and began to struggle, impatient, desperate to return to him. All those years of her taunting death, it should come as no surprise when death chose to return the favor. As always, it was Jimmy who provided her with much-needed patience and solace. Our love, his voice rang through her mind, his Irish lilt as crisp as fresh-bloomed jonquils, will live forever. He had used those same words, in both English and Gaelic, when he toasted her on the night they became engaged, drinking Guinness from champagne flutes, their glasses meeting with a sparkling chime. Promise? Grace had asked, reaching her hand with its new shimmering emerald engagement ring to wipe foam from his lip. Promise. Our love's too strong to die. That had been 4.5 years ago. Now Jimmy's voice rang clear once more, pealing like church bells on Easter morn. And so Grace struggled. Where was he? Grace fought. Harder than she ever had in life. She gagged and retched, struggling with the unseen forces keeping her from Jimmy. She felt pain. First it was faint. Distant pins and needles in her toes. Then a stabbing spiraling into her chest as she tried to force her lungs to expand. If her head had been less muddled, she might have remembered that corpses don't fight to breathe. But her entire being was focused on finding Jimmy. It had been so very long. His voice was so clear in her mind, he had to be near. As a final cacophony ricocheted through her head, she wrestled her eyes open, anticipating being greeted by Jimmy's wide grin. A bright white light flooded over her, drowning her in its brilliance. Grace did not close her eyes against the radiance. Damned if she would. Not after fighting so hard to get here. What the Eve, get her back under. A man's voice thundered through Grace's awareness, shattering the silence. I'm working on it, Dr. Hellman. The silhouette of a woman's head eclipsed the light filling Grace's vision. It's a reaction to the lucidine. Give me a second. Grace's body bucked as an invisible force drove air into her trachea, just as she was trying to breathe out. Her throat spasmed against the sneak attack. Tears seeped from her eyes. Corpses didn't cry. The woman turned toward her, revealing deep gray eyes above a surgical mask, wisps of blonde hair escaping from the paper cap that covered her head. Hurry up. I'm drilling into her brain. The unseen man's voice roared like a lion, dissolving into nonsense syllables, as it penetrated the mists shrouding Grace. He sounded nothing like Jimmy. Where was Jimmy? You at Angels of Mercy Medical Center, the woman told Grace in the chipper tones of a disc jockey announcing top 10 hits. Her hands flew in and out of Grace's peripheral vision, revealing fluttering glimpses of shiny glass ampules. I'm Dr. Warden. I'm going to put you back to sleep, and when you wake up again everything will be all right. Grace no longer fought the tears. She closed her eyes, surrendering the light. The woman lied. Jimmy was dead. And she was still very much alive. Everything would not be all right. Chapter 2 The Escape Grace Moran. 32-year-old white female presenting with new onset seizures. Yesterday, biopsy revealed a fast-growing, high-grade glioma originating in the right temporal lobe, Dr. Jonas Hellman, chief of neurosurgery, was saying when Vincent Embark entered the conference room. According to Vincent's watch, he was right on time for the Tuesday afternoon neurosurgical case conference, but obviously his watch and Dr. Hellman's did not agree. Vincent shuffled his stack of files and sidled toward the rear of the room, hoping to go unnoticed. The 6 neurosurgery attendings, each flanked by their own residents, surgical fellows and medical students, all turned to stare at Vincent as if he trespassed on hallowed ground. "Can I help you?" Hellman asked in a frosty tone, obviously irritated at having his presentation interrupted. So much for a low profile. Hellman was the last person Vincent wanted to piss off, not now when he needed the surgeon's support. Dr. Embark, pediatric chief resident, Vincent introduced himself. "I was invited." "Right, the pygmy doctor." Vincent ignored the insult. Hellman probably would have called him a flea if Vincent had introduced himself as a medical resident. What would the neurosurgeon call him if he knew Vincent had completed both residences? He was saved from replying by the entrance of a smiling blonde who breezed in with no apologies for being late. "Vincent, you made it." Dr. Eve Warden greeted him with enthusiasm, taking his hand and leading him to a chair. "Jonas, you remember Dr. Embark," she called to Hellman, ignoring the surgeon's glower. "I invited Vincent to present Catherine Jellicle's case." The surgeon grunted his acknowledgement. "We'll get to her in a minute." Hellman gestured for the lights to be dimmed and the 3-dimensional projector turned on. The air shimmered with a violent glow of color. "You can see the extent of the tumor. It involves the hypothalamus and amygdala, wrapping around the optic nerve." Someone in the back gave a low whistle. "That's one nasty sonophabich," came a murmur of appreciation from the audience. Vincent glanced up from his papers. Suddenly, he was inside the patient's brain. Her optic pathway shimmered in yellow, the hypothalamic nuclei and limbic system in blue. And, in the sickly sweet purple of spilled Kool-Aid, the tumor sprawled across the vital areas that controlled emotions, language, memory, and short, everything that made Grace Moran human. "A perfect candidate for my new procedure," Hellman announced. He strutted before the screen like a proud father, as if he'd given birth to the massive tumor himself. "It'll be a tricky one, Jonas," a gray-haired surgeon said with authority. Senior in years but not in prestige, Vincent thought, noting Hellman's bemused expression. At 48, Hellman was young to be chairman of neurosurgery, a fact that rankled his colleagues and caused him no small amount of satisfaction. The fact that he was also tall, still had a full head of hair, drove a new Porsche every year, and was an excellent surgeon didn't help him win any popularity contests among his fellow surgeons. "Are you certain you want her to be the first?" "Oh, yeah. This bastard is mine," Hellman replied with a grin. "And get this, the subject has a history of anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and agoraphobia. Caused by the tumor? No, pre-existing. Post-traumatic stress disorder. She hadn't left her house in nearly 4 years. We got her after her housekeeper found her unconscious on the floor and called 911. Lucky for us." Hellman smiled, his perfectly aligned teeth gleaming violet in the reflection of the projected image. "Right? If not for that, she'd probably have gone peacefully in her sleep." "How will you get psych on board?" another surgeon asked. "Don't have to. If she refuses the surgery, the tumor will kill her in a matter of weeks. Her past psych history gives me an out. I can have her committed and get a court order to operate if need be." "Think they'll go for that?" "It is an experimental procedure and awfully risky," the first surgeon argued. "If you were the one holding the scalpel, I'd agree." Hellman's reply was joined by the amused chuckles of his compatriots. "But no one's gonna let us sit back and watch this girl die. Not when I can save her life." And make medical history by doing so. Exactly, Hellman concluded, his smile widening until it pinged the P.T. Barnum end of the spectrum. A sucker born every minute, only this time the sucker in question was a woman fighting for her life. Vincent marveled at the way the surgeons diminished a woman's life to another challenge for their already overblown egos. Personally, he was more interested in what kind of trauma would have kept the patient, Grace Moran, imprisoned by her own fears and anxieties for so long. 4 years, Hellman had said. Now that the tumor had forced her from her sanctuary, how would she respond? Would she retreat again? Or fight to return to what most people regarded as the real world? Of course, with a tumor that pervasive, she could be lying in her bed a vegetable or worse. Hardly human. No conception of reality, maybe she'd already found her escape. Hellman brought the lights back up, a flick of his finger vanquishing the hungry mass devouring the woman's brain. I'm transferring her to the extended care unit today to begin brain mapping. If everything goes well, we'll operate on Friday-Saturday, if we have to get the court order. He jerked his chin at Vincent. The next case is Jellicle, my Rasmussen syndrome. Embark, would you like to present her medical history? Vincent got to his feet, gathering his files. As he passed her, Eve Warden reached out a hand and squeezed his arm in encouragement. She was well aware he needed to score points with Hellman, and had arranged for him to present Catherine Jellicle's case here today. Rasmussen syndrome is a viral encephalitis which systematically destroys brain tissue, he began after clearing his throat. If detected in its early stages, when still confined to one hemisphere of the brain, radical and aggressive surgical removal of the affected tissue has been shown to cure the disease. Otherwise, death is inevitable. Have you got everything? The grey-haired nurse bustled around Grace's room like a mother robin preparing a fledgling for flight. Spring doesn't start for 2 days. Too early for robins, Grace thought, staring out the window. Grey clouds threatened to smother Pittsburgh beneath their blanket of sleet and rain. She sighed, dreading venturing into the streets, where the wind whipped off the rivers to drive the rain into whirling daggers. The late winter chill would creep into her marrow and take up residence there, bringing with it a brittle ache rivaling the constant throbbing reverberating in her head. Pressure from the tumor, the pimple-faced surgery resident had told her after she woke from her brain biopsy. Not much they could do about it. Just get on with life and ignore it best you can, he and his comrades instructed Grace. Like they knew anything about life. Like they knew anything about anything. She scratched the tiny area of shaved skin around the 7 staples holding her scalp together. You don't have very much, do you? The nurse prattled on, thrusting the changes of underwear and socks Ingrid had brought Grace into a plastic bag labeled patient belongings. No coat. At least you've got your own shoes. There's some I've had to wheel out of here wearing paper booties from the OR. Grace looked down at the white Reeboks on her feet. Never had 2 feet been so lucky. Wouldn't last long out there without shoes. Out there. A shudder hijacked her body. Of course, the nurse continued, you're only going over to the extended care unit. You'll like it. It's in the new tower, everything's new over there. And fancy. I tell you, you won't even feel like you're still in the hospital while you're in the ECU. Grace ignored the nurse. She had no intention of staying anywhere in this hospital. Certainly she wasn't going to join the other lab rats in the research unit, no matter what new name they gave it. She smoothed imaginary wrinkles from her green fleece top and jeans, then turned away from the window. For the 1000th time she cursed Ingrid's sister for going into preterm labor, forcing the housekeeper to abandon Grace. An immediate flush of shame warmed her face. But how was she going to make it out of here without Ingrid? How was she going to make it home on her own? If you just leave that on the bed, I'll get it, she told the nurse, anxious to escape before her courage fled. No bother at all. I'm just glad Dr. Hellman can help you. You gave us all a scare, I'll have you know. It's amazing someone can be up and walking around with a tumor like that growing in their brain. I'll go get the chart ready and send the volunteer down with the wheelchair. She clasped Grace's limp hand between hers. Good luck, dear. Grace fought not to jerk away from the uninvited contact. Don't touch, insects buzzed as they swarmed through her body. The nurse held on, her lips moving, but the words could not penetrate the haze of panic. Wasps tunneled under her skin, crawling down each nerve ending, leaving her breathless and dizzy. Remember, we are all praying for you. The nurse mercifully released Grace. I'll see you after your surgery in a few days. Once the nurse was gone, Grace fled to the bathroom and began washing her hands in scalding water and Hibiclens, the ubiquitous pink hospital soap. She washed them 10 times, counting each cycle out loud as she took deep, cleansing breaths from her belly. Slowly, the buzzing subsided. Grace dried her hands on a paper towel, taking care not to touch the metal dispenser. She grabbed the plastic bag from her bed and fled before the nurse could return. Free at last, she told herself, gritting her teeth and crossing the threshold. She caught Jimmy's grin from the corner of her eye. Have a care for what you wish, he said, as rain pelted the window behind his transparent image. Going to join your girlfriends for tea? Kat Jellicle asked Alex Weiss when she caught up to him outside the glass walls of the pediatric playroom on the 3rd floor. Alex shook his head, leaning forward in his wheelchair, his blue eyes never wavering as he watched the 3 bald girls pour pretend tea into their plastic cups. Pink lace elastic headbands adorned their naked scalps. They each wore white dresses that swirled and ruffled whenever they moved. Behind their chairs stood 4 poles with noxious potions running through clear plastic tubing. Poison delivered directly into indwelling needles positioned above each girl's heart. Between 2 of the girls sat an emesis basin, ignored now that the daily afternoon tea party had begun in earnest. One of them, her scalp as smooth as melted chocolate, turned and flashed Alex a merry smile of invitation. Alex raised his hand to the window, skipping a quarter over his knuckles without looking at it. The girl nudged her companions. The coin danced back and forth over his fingers, mesmerizing them as the gleam of the overhead fluorescent lights twinkled off the quarter. He finished by pretending to throw the coin into the air, catching it then opening his hand to reveal it vanished from sight. His adoring audience applauded. Alex folded his arm across his chest and bowed from his waist, the oxygen tubing tugging over the back of his wheelchair. Come on, Kat urged her friend. You're too old for these kind of games. I was born too old. Alex sighed and straightened up in his chair. He was 10 years old and he was dying. Had been dying, in fact, since he was a few weeks old and the first exacerbation of his cystic fibrosis landed him in the ICU. You haven't said anything about my new do, Kat chided him, grabbing the wheelchair's handles and rocking him back and forth. She ducked her head down over his, shaking the purple licorice whip electrodes that snaked beneath the gauze dressing wrapped around her shaved scalp. The wires had been gathered in several strands of loosely woven braids before they inserted into a small recorder, slightly larger than a pager, which Kat wore on her waistband. So, do I look like a technopunk rasta, or what? 11, almost 12, Kat prided herself on her inventiveness. After all, what else did a girl with half a working brain and no hair, who'd spent the majority of the past 2 years in the hospital, have to work with? What happened to your pirate's hat? Needed a change of pace. Come on, let's blow this joint. And do what? Go back to the ECU where you belong. The 7th floor of the new tower housed the extended care unit where patients on research protocols resided. Right now Kat was its only pediatric patient. Back to the freak show? Kat asked, using her favorite derogatory for the ECU. No way, Jose. Let's tail a perp. Alex and Kat shared a passion for detective stories. They'd read the books, watch the shows and movies to the point where they could repeat much of the dialogue verbatim. And now, they practiced the real-life skills necessary to crime fighting. They'd spend hours on stakeouts, following hapless visitors and staff members through the hospital, then retreat to their secret hideout in the old annex on the 7th floor to compare notes. They were perfect for undercover work. Who would ever suspect a girl with half a brain and a boy with lungs so crippled he could barely walk, much less chase down a bad guy? There's a likely subject. Kat pointed through the glass walls to a petite, dark-haired woman watching the tea party from the other side of the playroom. Her skin was pale enough to warrant a transfusion, yet somehow, she didn't look hollowed out, empty, like someone dying. Instead, she seemed filled with an edgy energy. Her right hand was splayed against the window, long, narrow fingers yearning for what was beyond the glass. I'll bet she nabbed something from the gift shop and stashed it in that bag she's carrying. Or drugs from the pharmacy. Right, the top secret formula that will cure cancer. You got enough juice? Kat leaned down to check Alex's oxygen tank. Yeah, good to go. When she straightened, the woman was staring right at her. Their eyes met, separated by the expanse of the playroom, and Kat was surprised to see that the stranger's eyes were the same startling blue as Alex's. Then the woman broke the connection and bowed her head, moving away, her pace brisk, hardly the gait of an invalid. More like the panic of a sneak thief caught in the spotlight. Did you see that? Alex asked, a spark of animation in his voice for the first time in a long while. Kat hesitated. Her scalp itched. Not the usual irritation from the implanted electrodes or their dressing, more creepy-crawly. I've got a bad feeling about this kind of tingle. Hurry, we'll lose her. Alex obviously had no such misgivings. She followed his command. I cap N, warp speed coming up. Chapter 3 Lightning Strikes. Grace ignored the elevators and jogged down the steps from the third-floor pediatrics unit. Not because elevators were one of her phobias, they weren't. It was because Grace knew hospital elevators intimately, the ones at Angels of Mercy in particular. They were all slow, often stopping at every floor, and smelled of urine, vomit and the dried sweat of fear. Angels of Mercy Medical Center had changed since Grace was last here. The new research tower was finished, all gleaming glass and chrome, a tribute to modern science. The faces were new as well. The only familiar face she'd seen was Hellman's, and he had no reason to recognize an emergency medicine resident from 4 years ago, especially after all the changes she'd been through. Now she had a different name, a different face, was a different person. The old Grace had whiled away boring nights on call practicing her climbing holds on the metal railings that encircled these stairs. She craned her head up toward the flights above and sighed. The new Grace only wanted to get home and crawl into her bed, pull the covers over her head, and imagine Jimmy there beside her, counting down the breaths until she could rejoin him forever. A wave of vertigo hit. She leaned against the wall of the stairwell, clutching her plastic bag of possessions. If she had a seizure now, here on the concrete steps, she could do some serious damage. She imagined her body tumbling, bouncing down the steps, landing in a crumbled heap at the bottom. The thought didn't frighten her the way it should. It wouldn't necessarily be a bad way to go. If she could guarantee the results. She moved over to the railing, looking down 2.5 flights to the bottom. Soaring, flying over the edge, down, down, that would be a better death than her brain imploding under pressure from the tumor. Poetic even. She shook her head and the wave of vertigo subsided. No seizure, no drop attack followed. Probably just good old-fashioned hunger. Besides, she didn't want to die here surrounded by sterile walls and strangers. She wanted to die at home, with Jimmy. She continued down, her steps clattering and echoing throughout the stairwell. Home, she needed to get home. Kat and Alex rounded the corner in time to see the stairwell door swing shut. Shit, Kat said, ignoring Alex's frown of disapproval. He hated it when she swore, so Kat made a point of doing it loudly and often. Whenever any adults were around, she'd go off on jags of scatological tirades, shake the electrodes planted deep within her brain, then grin at them like the madwoman of Charlotte. Most of them ran away after that, leaving her and Alex in peace. Kat had a million ways to get rid of prying adults, from volunteers to nurses to her own parents. After a dozen hospitalizations, each longer than the last, she was a pro. She jabbed the elevator button and was rewarded when the doors opened immediately. "Hold it," she told Alex, pushing him inside where he could reach the controls. While he held the door, she sped to the stairwell, listening for footsteps. She hopped back on board the elevator. "Down," she said breathlessly. "Definitely going down. There's nothing on 2 but radiology." Alex debated, his finger hovering over the buttons. "I say 1, the main lobby, cafeteria, pharmacy, ER." Kat nodded her agreement, and he pushed the button for the first floor. Kat drummed her fingers impatiently on the back of Alex's chair. They'd never had a suspect use the stairs before. Usually the hardest part was trying to look inconspicuous while crowding on the elevator with the people they tailed. "We need to steal one of the elevator keys. Then we can call an elevator whenever we want." It wasn't an impossible idea. Kat's distractions and Alex's sleight of hand had already garnered them keys to the old rooftop helipad, the 7th floor annex, and the basement boiler room. Not bad for a couple of kids. Finally, the elevator came to a halt on the first floor. Kat pushed Alex out, parking him at the junction between the corridors leading to the cafeteria and the ER. She pushed the stairwell door ajar, listening. At first, there was silence and she worried that they'd lost their quarry. Then the tap-tap of sneaker-clad shoes began to approach. "Keep your eyes open," she told Alex. She took up her own position in the hospital gift shop, where she could watch the paths to the main lobby and the pharmacy. The volunteer at the register looked at her in disapproval, as Kat grabbed a copy of Cosmopolitan to hide behind. The dark-haired woman emerged from the stairwell between her and Alex, moving past Kat without glancing in her direction. The itching beneath Kat's scalp grew from annoying to nerve-jarring, now accompanied by the telltale smell of wet horse. "Shit, not now." The magazine began to rustle then shake as Kat's hand twitched uncontrollably, her fist clenching without direction, crumbling the magazine into a wrinkled cylinder. "Damn seizure." She forced herself to breathe deep, willing the seizure to remain partial, only usurping her arm and hand, refusing to allow it to spread further through her brain or body. "Are you all right?" the volunteer asked, her voice sugary with politeness. "Go away," Kat said through clenched teeth, all her concentration and willpower focused on her renegade brain. Their suspect turned toward the main lobby. She heard the wheels of Alex's wheelchair graze across the carpet, stopping in front of the gift shop. "Come on," he urged, breathless with the exertion. "I'm calling for help." The volunteer went behind the counter to the phone. Kat tried to drop the magazine. Her hand remained clenched tight. To hell with it. She took her place behind Alex and began pushing him with one hand. They couldn't lose their prey. Grace disapproved of the new decor in the lobby. It must have been updated when the tower opened. She crossed over thick cinnamon-colored carpet that reminded her of rotting peaches. From the volunteer desk wafted the odor of flowers not quite decayed. What designer had convinced them that this decor evoked feelings of confidence or a healing atmosphere? The wood was stained an ochre color. The art covering the walls consisted of twisted pieces of rusted steel. To Grace's eyes it appeared splattered with blood, as if it was evidence recycled from crime scenes. She shuddered and quickened her steps toward the large revolving doors at the entrance. Here was her escape, her way home. Back to Jimmy. Rain buffeted the glass, creating an impenetrable gray shroud beyond the brightly lit lobby. Grace hesitated, pulling her hand back from the cold steel surrounding the vibrating glass. Her breathing quickened and the hairs on the back of her arms stood at attention. Beyond the doors, storm clouds stacked high, threatening to swallow the sky. She gathered her strength couldn't keep Jimmy waiting and entered the revolving door, leaning her weight against the bar to propel it forward. As soon as it began to move, trapping her within its embrace, she realized her mistake. Wind pummeled the glass walls of her cage, blows from an invisible assailant, amplified to a mind-shattering intensity. Grace struggled to push the door further, to escape. It didn't move. She pounded her fists against the walls, trying to alert someone in the outside world to her predicament. Water sluiced against the glass and the only figure visible was a silver-haired man dressed in black. He stood in the middle of the drive, impervious to the wind and rain. Cars passed him on either side, yet he did not move. The rain blurred his face, but the way he stood, something about him seemed so very familiar. Grace pressed her palm flat against the frigid glass in supplication. The man nodded his head, as if he saw her. She was saved. Wind gusted, blowing a sheet of water horizontally against the door, shaking it violently. When the glass cleared, the man had vanished. Fear tightened its grip on her. Her pulse throbbed in her temples. Then the buzzing started. Hordes of wasps stinging, taunting. They crawled under her skin, the panic attack drenching her in sweat, stealing her breath, as she hyperventilated. Home, she had to get home. She focused her entire being on her goal, ignoring the ringing in her ears, the pounding of her heart and head, the numbing void conquering her limbs. Still the wasp stung and buzzed, the rain thundered, and the door refused to yield. She dropped her bag and pushed with all her might, rushing halfway past the exit, almost imprisoning herself within the glass coffin once again. Cold air swept in to embrace her, to coax her out into the open. She took one tentative step toward freedom. Lightning shattered the world. Thunder followed close on its heels. The pounding in her head grew to blinding proportions. Grace closed her eyes against the blue brilliance of another lightning strike. Its ferocity stabbed through her eyelids, and she winced in pain. She cowered against the door, as thunder shook the building. Then the cold air and blinding light were gone. Grace opened her eyes to the smell of burnt flesh, and almost collapsed in anguish. She had fallen against the door, pushing it further along its circumference. Wheel of misfortune. The glass cage trapped her once more. The wasps whirled in a victory dance. Grace shuddered, ignoring the tears that warmed her cheeks. She bowed her head and slumped against the unwelcoming, cold glass wall. Alex watched in dismay as the woman entered the revolving doors, becoming trapped before she could escape to the outside world. He looked around at the other people in the lobby, two blue-haired women sitting behind the volunteer desk, the clerk with the thin mustache and thinner lips at the registration desk, a security guard reading a newspaper, his back to the rain and cold of the world beyond the lobby. None of them noticed the woman's look of panic, the terror that widened her eyes. Alex did, his own body breaking out in an anxious sweat as she pounded her fists against the glass doors. He wanted to dash forward, to take the blue-eyed woman's hands in his, to save her. He bounced in his chair, frustrated that there was no way he could help her. Fear of an unseen menace clamped around his throat like the cold hand of a murderer. "Closer," he urged Kat. "She'll spot us." "Closer, I need to be closer." Kat pushed his chair over the carpet toward the doors. Their quarry was trapped, like a lab rat caught in a maze. Kat reached up to stroke her electrodes. She knew the feeling well. She found herself leaning forward, unable to tear her eyes from the woman's silent struggles. Alex's breathing became rapid with excitement when the woman finally broke free. But then two blinding lightning strikes crashed just beyond the doors, between her and freedom. He watched her recoil from a peal of thunder only to become trapped once more inside the prison of glass. Kat gripped his hand so hard his fingers cried out in protest. So he wasn't imagining it. She too saw the invisible forces driving the woman, herding her like a panic-stricken lamb to slaughter. "Wait here," Kat told him. Alex admired her courage as she crossed the lobby, purple electrodes whipping behind her. She paused in front of the frozen doors. He wanted to call out a warning for her not to enter, but kept his silence. Kat studied the situation. Instead of moving inside the partitions, she reached out to grab the door's edge, her fingers barely fitting between the rubber gaskets that held it in place. She wrenched it forward. The door fought her, writhing in her grasp like it was a living, breathing creature. There was a high-pitched whine and the glass grudgingly moved. Then came a gust of foul-smelling air, as if the woman was being belched from the smoldering pit of Jonah's whale. With a final surge of effort, Kat tugged the door far enough open for it to disgorge its captive. "Hey, that door's not a toy." A meaty hand landed on Kat's shoulder. The security guard had left his newspaper to chastise her. He bent down and picked up the woman's abandoned plastic bag. "This yours?" Kat nodded, her breath choking against the stench of brimstone and hellfire emanating from the doorway. The guard handed her the bag, oblivious to anything except his need to return to the sports page. "Thank you," she breathed, turning away before the guard could ask any more questions. TSK, it's all right, everything's all right, love." Jimmy's arm was warm comfort around Grace's shoulders, banishing the wasps and the terror that accompanied them. He was there. She could feel him this time, as well as hear him. Would he still be there if she opened her eyes? Would he be whole once more? Or merely the transparent wisp of memory that had taunted her ever since she woke from her brain biopsy? Did it even matter anymore? Grace kept her eyes closed as Jimmy led her from the revolving doors, back to the lobby with its overwhelming stench of dead carnations. "Come with me, love," he coaxed. She opened her eyes when she felt his fingers under her chin, tilting her face up. He looked down at her. His face was whole, unblemished, a mischievous grin curling his lips. A mop of unruly red gold curls circled his head, and his hazel gaze sparked with life. His hand slid down to wrap itself around hers, and he took a step further into the lobby. He looked over his shoulder at her when she froze. "Have I ever led you wrong?" It didn't matter where he led. Grace was amazed at the peace his presence settled upon her. She would follow wherever he would go. He tugged at her like a child, leading her across the desolation of the lobby, back onto the elevator. Grace stood, watching as her hand moved without volition, following his pointing finger to press a button. 7. What on earth was on the 7th floor? Why was he taking her there? Where did those men come from? Alex asked after Kat escaped from the guard and rejoined him. "What men?" Kat heaved hard against the chair to get it started on the carpet. "The guard?" "No. I saw you push the door open and bend over to pick up the bag. When I looked up again, there were 2 men with her. One guy looked like a priest or something dressed all in black. The other, he hugged her, kind of looked like he was going to cry or something." He broke off, took several shallow breaths, trying to understand what he'd seen, how to explain it. The priest guy looked kinda normal, almost too normal. But the other man, the one with red hair, he'd been all shimmery like he didn't know what. The only thing he'd ever seen that came close was those holy pictures with the golden halos glowing around people. Or the old Star Trek episodes when the transporter malfunctioned. "I don't get it," he continued when he got his breath back. "I swear those men didn't come in through the door. They must have gotten past you while you weren't looking. Which way did they go?" Kat pushed him past the reception desk. "I don't know where the priest went. But the woman and the other guy went into the elevator." 7. Alex grabbed the bag from her hands and motioned for her to turn him around. The elevator stopped on 7. "Let's go." Kat hesitated. He banged his hand against the arm of the chair in frustration. "I don't know. I have a bad feeling about this," she said, the taste of copper and burnt ashes still tightening her throat. Maybe we should find someone else to follow. Or go watch a DVD. We could sneak some hot cocoa from the nurse's kitchen. Alex turned his head to face her. He was frowning, his eyes blazing with intensity, not to be denied. No, he insisted. I have to meet her. I don't know who she is, but she seems so familiar. Kat, I think that woman saved my life. You saw her. She's acting nuts. Probably came from the psych ward or something. I'm serious. His forehead creased as he concentrated, trying to clarify his feeling. Maybe she didn't save my life yet, he said, his voice sounding far away. Maybe she will save my life. Later. Kat leaned down and checked the oxygen level on Alex's tank. She hated when he said things like that, giving her this creepy nervous feeling in the pit of her stomach like grasshoppers fighting to get out. The tank was almost full. No answers there. She was silent as she pushed the chair over to the elevator and pressed the up button. Sometimes Alex reminded her of a book she'd once read about the wizard Merlin. Alex was also living his life backwards, dying much too young, but knowing more than most grown-ups. The elevator arrived and Kat wheeled Alex inside. The doors slid shut behind them, and she heard a woman laughing. Her palms began to sweat as she clenched the grips of the chair's handles. It sounded like Eve Warden, the physician in charge of the extended care unit. The biggest freak in the freak show, Kat liked to joke, but she couldn't hide the truth from herself. Warden was the only thing in this world Kat was truly, deeply, intensely frightened of. Eve Warden controlled Kat's dreams, her seizures, her chances of living through the surgery Dr. Hellman had planned for Kat. Eve Warden held Kat's fate in her bony-fingered hands. And anything that made her laugh could not be good. Chapter 4 Hide and Seek. Nice presentation, Vincent. Eve Warden lingered after the neurosurg conference to speak with the pediatric chief resident. It surprised her how close in age she and Vincent Embark were. She was 38, and he was 35. Yet, he was only beginning his career, and she was about to achieve the pinnacle of hers. As Eve admired Vincent's well-sculptured body and dark, Mediterranean good looks, she wondered if he realized she had been studying him since he first came to Angels of Mercy 9 months ago, that she had chosen him, had been grooming him oh so carefully. She needed a new associate for her next venture, someone with experience with both adult and pediatric patients, someone who would be as enthusiastic about his work as he was his partner. She brushed against Vincent's hip. He didn't shy away from the contact. His rugged good looks would be a definite asset in attracting the right kind of private patient to her clinic. And those hands large, calloused, the hands of a working man. Eve took in a sharp breath as she imagined those hands on her body. You need to spend more time up in the extended care unit, she told Vincent. I know you're focusing on pediatrics right now, but I have some very interesting adult patients as well. Did you tell him we need to use Lucidine on Catherine Jellicle? Jonas Hellman interrupted her. Eve frowned at the neurosurgeon. She was probably the only person in the hospital who could get away with giving Hellman a look like that. But she and Jonas had been partners both in and out of the operating room for years. Eve's specialty in neuroanesthesia had proven invaluable to the surgeon in his development of new operative techniques. She liked to think she was the power behind the power, that she'd molded the man, shaped his career, enhancing her own in the process. Her work with Jonas had led to patents on several monitoring devices and drug protocols, gaining her prestige and financial freedom. Although Jonas didn't know it yet, she was ready to move on. The surgeon had grown too predictable. His egocentric demands, constant need for attention was wearisome. She needed fresh blood. Like Vincent. He would be an invigorating change of pace. We hadn't gotten there yet, Eve told the surgeon, wishing he'd leave this to her. Jonas didn't get the hint. He never did. Jellicle keeps sabotaging her recording, he told Vincent, acting as if the 11-year-old girl was insulting him personally by not following his instructions. I need somewhere between 10 to 14 hours more to finish mapping her seizures. I want Eve to put her under with lucidine. I can't operate until I have that information. Vincent looked puzzled. Lucidine? Lucidine, Hellman told him. Haven't you been following Dr. Warden's work? Vincent's duties are keeping him on the pediatric floor, Jonas. Still, the man's boarded in both medicine and pediatrics, he should be keeping current. Though I don't know why anyone would waste that much time doing both residences. I could have made a surgeon out of you in the same time. A chance to cut was a chance to cure. Eve prudently held her tongue. Jonas routinely disparaged any branch of medicine that didn't involve arms plunged deep inside body cavities. He even ridiculed her own field of anesthesia, calling it 99% boredom and 1% panic, despite the fact that without Eve's help he never could have progressed to become head of the neurosurgery department. The two men squared off with her in the middle. Maybe if you did more reading you wouldn't be in the midst of a malpractice suit, Embark, Jonas added injury to insult. One that I understand is not going favorably. He shook his head in mock dismay. Doesn't bode well for your chance at receiving a permanent appointment here. Vincent bristled at that. They all knew Jonas, as chairman of the hospital's executive committee, had the final say in which physicians were allowed on staff. And Jonas could also easily use his influence to help Vincent with his malpractice case. If he were so inclined. She held her breath, waiting to see which way Vincent would play the encounter. Would he vent his anger at Jonas's insults or meekly take it, currying favor with the chief of neurosurgery? Lucidine, Vincent began, making Eve smile as he proved the neurosurgeon wrong in the most diplomatic way possible. The lad had brains in addition to looks. The trade name for alpha-methylcyclidine is a new striated muscle relaxant that does not cross the blood-brain barrier, allowing patients to experience anesthesia and paralysis of their body without sedation. He recited Eve's research virtually verbatim. Combined with the Farwell technique of brain stimulation, it allows the neurosurgeon, Vincent nodded to Hellman, to operate while simultaneously assessing the surgery's effects on the patient's brain centers. What I don't understand is why you want to use it on Cat Jellicle. Because I need that information, Jonas snapped. I'm beginning to use lucidine outside the confines of the OR, Eve explained, placing her hand on Vincent's arm. His muscles were rock hard, making her almost purr with delight. I have to monitor a case in the OR now, but come up to the ECU at 5 o'clock. I've got a bariatric patient due for a treatment. How does anesthesia treat obesity? Vincent asked. Eve laughed. You'd be surprised what I can treat with lucidine. It's going to revolutionize medicine for those of us with enough imagination. What about my patient? Jonas broke in, obviously feeling left out. Don't worry, Eve assured him, laying her other hand on the surgeon's arm, enjoying the energy that flowed between the men, through her body. She felt Jonas tense and knew he was suspicious, but his ego was too big to allow him to imagine that she'd ever leave him for a lowly resident. Have I ever let you down? Was this what it felt like to go insane? Grace wondered as Jimmy's arms snugged her closer to his body. The elevator seemed possessed, flying to the 7th floor without stopping. If this was insanity, then she understood why so many psych patients refused treatment. It was intoxicating, arousing, this feeling that she was in her own universe, far away from the filth and ugliness of the real world. And to have Jimmy with her heaven couldn't compare. She understood that he was here because of the tumor. Some random focus of out-of-control cells had impinged upon small folds of neurons in her hippocampus, generating Jimmy's image, his voice, the tang of Old Spice that lingered in the air when he appeared. Even knowing that didn't make his presence any less real. Just as the sudden clench in her gut and the rapid pounding of her heart, The absolute pang of joy she felt each and every time she saw him again was real. As was the desolation when he vanished. Because, despite the multitude of medical reasons why he could not exist, Grace still believed. She'd been watching, waiting, for long years for something to believe in. This was the tumor's gift. Allowing her to remember Jimmy, with hope instead of terror and despair. To reunite her with her love. To prepare her for death. It was a gift she was unwilling to relinquish. The tumor could have her body, she was done with it. The very first time Grace met Jimmy, he'd rescued her. Leave it to him to find a way to return from the dead and save her once more. She took a deep breath, reveling in the musk of Jimmy's sweat and Old Spice deodorant. After he died, she had tried to recreate that smell, even using the men's deodorant herself. But it hadn't worked. She didn't have the right chemistry to turn the tangy perfume into Jimmy's warm scent of security. Grace had left the stick of Old Spice open in Jimmy's closet, a sachet of loneliness. Nights when she couldn't sleep, which were most, she'd pull out one of his shirts, wrap herself in its embrace, inhaling his scent. It was an illusion, but what wasn't anymore? The elevator doors opened. She stepped out on the 7th floor. They slid shut behind her, taking Jimmy with them. Grace whirled, the sudden emptiness a knife spiraling through her gut. Grace wrapped her arms around her chest, failing to recreate the warmth Jimmy had brought her even if he was just a figment of a brain gone bad. He'd be back. She was certain. Jimmy would never abandon her. Not again. God, she wished she was back at home. An errant tear slipped from her eye before she could blink it back. She looked around. When she'd been a resident here at Angels, the 7th floor annex had been a second home, a refuge for her. Now everything had changed. To her left, a set of metal double doors with windows inset in them guarded the new glass-walled skyway leading to the research tower. In front of her, the door to the roof, where the helipad had been when she was a resident, looked dingy and unused, neglected. She looked to her right and saw the scratched wooden door leading to the call rooms and the small kitchen and lounge where they'd had parties. Her body shook with a feeling of unbelonging. She needed to go home. She wasn't a doctor anymore. Here she was only a stranger in a strange yet familiar land. "Forgive me my trespasses," she whispered, a stray bit of an old prayer Brother Leo had taught her when she was a little girl. She'd felt the Jesuit's presence ever since she'd woken in the operating room yesterday. Probably because without Leo, she never would have met Jimmy in the first place. Hugging her arms around her chest, she regarded the brightly colored signs directing elevator passengers to the left, to the tower via the skyway, as if nothing of importance remained behind the other two, older, forgotten doors. The two doors that once had been the most important in her life. One leading to the adrenaline rush of desperate flight to a fresh trauma scene, the other to the promise of a few moments of peace and quiet in an otherwise turbulent workday. Grace leaned her head against the window of the door leading to the roof. "Is this why you brought me here?" she asked Jimmy. She remembered her earlier fantasy of flying through the air, falling down the stairwell. The roof was a much more practical solution, guaranteed success from 7 stories up. Despite its weight, the fire door rattled against a gust of wind and rain. "No, please let me go home, let it happen there. We'll leave jumping as a last resort, shall we, love?" She thought the last with an overblown Irish brogue always guaranteed to make Jimmy chuckle at how Yanks seemed unable to master the Queen's English in any proper fashion. "Hello." A small voice from behind her made Grace jump. She whirled around, half expecting to see another ghost. A much too skinny to be healthy boy in a wheelchair emerged from the elevator, pushed by a young girl in jeans and a Godsmack t-shirt, her shaven scalp sprouting electrodes. "Hello," Grace replied, smiling at the unlikely duo. The boy was wearing comfortable over-large sweats with the Pittsburgh Steelers logo on them. "We saw you downstairs at the playroom," the boy continued. "And then in the lobby. He paused frequently to breathe. His lips were tinged blue despite the oxygen he wore. He held out his hand to her. "I'm Alex Weiss." Grace shook the grave young boy's hand with a firm grip. 3+ clubbing distorted his fingernails, a sure sign of chronic oxygen deprivation. "Heart or lungs?" Alex's companion stared at her with suspicion. Grace tried another smile, hoping she wasn't so out of practice that she frightened the children. "I'm Grace." It wasn't until Alex released her hand that she realized there'd been no panic, not even a tinge of anxiety at his touch. Before she could puzzle that through, the girl stepped forward and held out her hand as well. Cat Jellicle," the girl muttered, shaking hands even as her eyes scrutinized Grace's face with the look of a well-trained cynic. Grace's smile widened on its own, no buzzing with Cat either. She felt normal. Was this another gift of the tumor? Curing one disease even as it killed her with another. "You dropped this." Cat retrieved the plastic bag with Grace's few belongings from Alex's lap and handed it to her. Grace glanced down at the bag, forgotten during her panic attack in the revolving doors. Maybe not so cured after all. "What happened downstairs?" Alex asked. "What was in there with you?" Grace glanced away, out the window, toward the skyway leading to the gleaming research tower. Kids saw entirely too much. She didn't want them to think her crazy, hated to have them disappointed in her so soon. She shrugged and scuffed her feet against the linoleum. "You can't leave, can you?" He continued relentlessly. "Is that why you came up here to hide in the annex?" Grace looked up at that. Kat's expression was one of skepticism, while Alex's face held wonder and awe. Surely not for her. What was going on here? Too many questions, she heard Jimmy's chuckle echo through her. Always asking too many questions. Before Grace could say anything, Kat jerked her head, her electrodes whipping behind her. She rushed over to press her face against the glass pane inset in the door leading to the skyway. "Geez it, the cops. Nurse Cray, coming in fast." "Give me the annex key," Alex said. Kat dug in the pockets of her jeans, her eyes never leaving the window. "I don't have them, you must." Alex began to rummage through the various bags attached to his chair. A deck of cards came and went, followed by packages of shrink-wrapped pills, several quarters, a Cosmo, 2 inhalers, bits of string and assorted rubber bands, Kleenex both used and virginal, a water bottle, snack bars, baseball cards, and finally, a key ring. "Got him," he said in triumph. "Too late. Hide." Alex beckoned Grace to push him behind the second door, while Kat opened the other and breezed through it onto the skyway. Grace huddled beneath the window. Even safely anchored on the annex, she could feel the vibrations as the wind tore at the glass-walled bridge across the abyss separating the annex and the tower. "Mrs. Cray, nice to see you." Kat met the nurse halfway across the skyway. The acoustics in the walkway were strange, creating hollow echoes, carrying voices in waves and amplifying them to a deafening volume that made Grace's teeth ache. "Catherine, I've been looking all over for you." Pediatrics called, wanting to know where Alexander was. "It's not my job to be chasing you two all over the hospital. If you can't act responsibly, I'll have Dr. Embark put you back on restriction." "Alex is with the chemo trio," Kat told the nurse. "Really, Catherine? You're much too cynical for an 11-year-old. 12, I'll be 12 on Thursday." Grace heard steel in the girl's voice as she corrected the nurse. "Then you're still 11, Cray continued. "Go get Alexander back to his room. I expect you resting quietly in your room for the rest of the day." "Yes, ma'am." Grace heard the grudging surrender in Kat's voice and knew it must have cost the girl dearly to bow to the nurse's will. She promised herself she'd pay the 11, almost 12-year-old back when she could. The door beside them opened, and Kat returned to the sanctuary of the elevator lobby. She looked through the window. "She's gone," back to the freak show. Kat pushed Alex to the annex door. He selected a key and twisted it in the lock. Despite the swelling of his fingertips, he moved with confident dexterity. Kat wheeled Alex through the door and looked back over her shoulder at Grace. "We don't have all day." Grace hurried through the door, shutting it behind her. The smell of stale bug spray hit her first, wrinkling her nose. She followed Kat and Alex down the narrow tile-walled hallway. Half of the overhead fluorescent lights were missing, the rest blinking in random intervals, casting the empty wing into an eerie half-light. The call room doors stood open, only a few still furnished with narrow steel-framed beds naked except for plastic-covered mattresses. The windows were grimy. Dust covered the grey and brown linoleum, as well as the few pieces of furniture that remained. "Don't the residents still use their call rooms?" "Not since the tower opened," Kat told her with the voice of authority. "Now they have call rooms on every patient floor." Sounded convenient, but a hell of a lot less fun. Grace remembered the impromptu parties and all-night card games that broke the drudgery of every other night call. Not that any of them had a lot of free time, but it was nice to know you weren't alone as you waited for the pager to interrupt whatever small pleasure you'd immersed yourself in. "Like sleep." "Oh," was all she said as she followed Kat and Alex into the largest call room, the one traditionally reserved for chief residents, with its private bath and proximity to the kitchen. Here there was no dust, the bed was made with hospital linens and the desk and bookcase were brimming with tattered paperbacks and magazines. Photos torn from magazines, drawings, drug ads and deflated mylar balloons festooned the walls. A clubhouse, Grace realized. She looked at the two kids. "How long have you guys been here?" Kat jangled her electrodes. 14 admissions over 2 years, this is my longest 10 weeks and counting." Alex was blushing. "I came when I was 3 weeks old." She blinked at that. "You've been a patient here since you were 3 weeks old. But your parents?" Kat shook her head, warning Grace from her position behind Alex. Grace shut up. "I've been out a few times, but no more than a week or 2 at a time," Alex went on. "My mom left me here when I was a baby. It's hard to find foster parents for sick babies." He shrugged philosophically. Grace looked again at the young boy. Alexander Weiss. Now she knew why the name rang a bell. He'd been a patient in the PED's ICU when she was a resident. She remembered one of the attendings had talked about maybe adopting him, but something happened and it fell through. Cystic fibrosis, severe. He'd be, 10 now? That was older than the experts had expected him to live. She smiled at the boy. He'd fooled them all. "We've got to go," Kat said. "Crayfish is waiting and the wicked witch makes her rounds in an hour." "You'll be safe here," Alex told the woman. "Grace?" He was reluctant to leave her, but couldn't figure out if it was because he was frightened for her or of her. Kat wheeled him out the door and into the hallway. "We'll be back." They hadn't gotten far when he felt his chair begin to jerk and buck. "Kat?" He craned his head to look over his shoulder just in time to see her body hit the floor with a sickening thud. As the night falls, the secrets of Grace and the truth of this hospital are slowly revealed. Don't go away, subscribe to our channel to uncover the next astonishing truth.